A white passenger kicked a baby's stroller mid-flight, but when the father revealed his Navy SEAL credentials, the cabin went silent. A white passenger kicked a baby's stroller, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize the father was a Navy SEAL, ready to reveal his badge and take control of the situation in seconds. The moment that stroller was struck, the cabin's power dynamic flipped. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant real strength steps in. The stroller's front wheel clipped the edge of a black duffel bag with a soft thump, barely enough to disturb its owner, but it drew a sharp glance from the man standing beside it. Darren Holt paused, his fingers tightening around the stroller handle as he instinctively assessed the sudden shift in energy. The man, mid-40s, lean frame, slate-gray coat, had been lurking too close for comfort for several minutes now, tailing him from the main atrium of Veltran Gateport. Darren didn't need to look twice to recognize a pattern. The man wasn't lost. He wasn't browsing. He was following, and that made him dangerous. Leron stirred in the stroller with a faint sigh, his chubby hands curling around the edge of a soft blanket. Darren leaned forward slightly, as if adjusting the canopy, but his eyes swept the reflection in the polished terminal floor. The man was watching the stroller, not him. Not casually, intently. It wasn't the look of a stranger amused by a baby's sleepy charm. It was clinical, cold, calculated. Darren straightened, keeping his movements relaxed. His boots struck the terminal floor with the silent rhythm of someone who had learned to move without drawing attention. On the surface, he was just another traveling father. Buttoned-up wool coat, worn leather satchel slung across one shoulder, face marked by the subtle weariness of early parenthood. But under the coat, stitched into the inner chest lining, was a flat pocket sealed with Vel-Shield fabric. Inside it rested a navy blue identification badge edged in silver. It bore no company name, no rank, only a silent symbol recognizable to a very specific kind of person. The badge of the Naval Special Response Division, the kind that didn't get shown unless everything else had failed. He walked on, weaving through the slow-moving crowd toward Gate 72. A holiday family passed by, a boy dragging a toy suitcase shaped like a cartoon jet. Darren stepped aside slightly, giving them room. The man behind him, Rhett Varson, the name would come later, adjusted his pace again, staying just close enough to remain inside Darren's awareness without overtaking him. "Parents who don't belong here," Rhett muttered, voice low but not low enough. The words hung in the air like oil smoke, acrid and intentional. Darren didn't stop. His left hand gently rocked the stroller as they passed a food kiosk. His right hand, hidden beneath his coat, touched the edge of the zipper that concealed the badge. Not yet. Not here. Not unless the next move demanded it. He glanced up at the nearest departure board. Flight 623 to Elvern City. On time. That gave him 20 minutes until boarding. 20 minutes to either neutralize the situation or let it unravel on someone else's timeline. He chose neither. Instead, he veered slightly off course toward a quieter seating cluster near a coffee vendor. He parked the stroller, knelt to check Laurent's foot strap, and listened. Rhett moved past him, pretending to check his phone, but his eyes flicked back twice in the glass reflection of a vending machine. The man was pretending not to observe. Badly. That told Darren two things. This wasn't a professional tale, and the man wasn't alone. He was either emboldened by backup or reckless from underestimation. "Come on, kiddo," Darren whispered, adjusting Laurent's blanket with a gentle pat. The boy blinked up at him with sleepy trust, unaware that his father was counting exits, surveying angles, calculating threat radius. Rhett returned to hover nearby, arms folded, shoulders squared too tightly for comfort. There was something in the man's eyes. Resentment, yes, but also intent. Not a drunk's grumble, not a busy traveler's frustration. Intent. Darren stood up slowly, pushing the stroller back into motion, and once again Rhett synced his pace. One row behind, one column to the left. He wasn't hiding anymore. That was confirmation enough. Darren turned slightly, looked directly at him. "Can I help you?" Rhett smiled. It wasn't warm. "Just walking." "Then keep walking." Darren's voice was low, neutral, but the way he squared his shoulders shifted the temperature around them. A few nearby passengers noticed. Rhett didn't respond. He fell back half a step, but his gaze burned into the stroller. Darren pushed forward. Gate 72 loomed ahead. A few families had already gathered. A businessman in a gray overcoat paced while muttering into a headset. A gate agent adjusted a placard behind the counter. The terminal's chatter rose and fell like distant waves. Darren approached the queue zone, parked the stroller by a pillar, and shifted to block Rhett's line of sight. He knelt to check the storage pouch beneath the stroller, not because he needed to, but because it gave him an excuse to scan behind. Rhett stood still, hands in pockets now, eyes cold, watching, waiting. Something in the air felt wrong. Darren knew this kind of wrong. He'd felt it on rooftops in foreign capitals, in ambush zones buried under peaceful villages. He exhaled through his nose. The badge in his jacket suddenly felt heavier, not as proof of power, but as a door. Once opened, it couldn't be shut. He stood, rolled the stroller closer to the gate. Leiron shifted and murmured, and Darren ran his hand over the baby's head. A father's motion, a soldier's focus. Rhett took 2 steps forward. Close, too close. The gate agent made a general boarding announcement. Darren rolled forward slowly. Rhett followed. He was done wondering. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't frustration. This was a setup, and he had just walked into it with a child. Something in the air felt wrong, but the storm had only just begun. The ceramic clink of a teacup shattering against tile jolted the quiet. Marin Solvac, the young gate agent, had stumbled forward in the tightening crowd, and the steaming splash of hot tea missed Darren Holt's stroller by inches. Reacting instantly, Darren shifted the stroller back with precision, his right hand shielding Leiron's body with a quiet motion honed from years of training. The baby blinked but didn't cry, just a sharp inhale, a flicker of startle. The moment passed quickly. "I'm so sorry, sir," Marin said, flustered, crouching with napkins already out. "That wasn't my fault. Darren offered only a nod. "It's fine," he said, voice low and even. No judgment, no escalation, just control. But from 2 seats away, a muttered voice slithered through the air. "People like you always get in the way." Rhett Varson. Same rigid posture, same crooked smirk. His eyes, which had already been lingering too long on the stroller, now narrowed with smug satisfaction as if the spilled tea had been karmic justice. His words weren't whispered. They were just loud enough to prick the air, calculated to reach Darren and the passengers seated nearby. Several travelers glanced up. One older man furrowed his brow, unsure whether to intervene. A young couple exchanged wary looks, but no one spoke. The social tension, sharp and silent, froze them in place. Darren didn't turn his head. He simply bent down, adjusted the stroller's front wheel, then checked the harness over Leiron's chest with deliberate care. In his mind, a shift had already begun. Not panic, calculation. His former life whispered beneath the surface, brushing against muscle memory and protocols. When a situation escalates in slow motion, restraint buys time. And, right now, time was all he needed to figure out whether Rhett was just a bigot or something worse. Across from him, Rhett's heel tapped the floor in an impatient rhythm, syncopated, pointed. Then he looked down at his phone, glanced at Darren again, and that's when it happened. A single message flashed across the screen in gray block letters. "Proceed, if father is present." Rhett didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply locked the screen, tucked it away, and sat back with the look of a man who had just received clearance to do something irreversible. Darren hadn't seen the message, but he saw the change in Rhett's posture. The way his shoulders stopped twitching and instead held tension like a coiled spring. The kind of posture that meant control wasn't lost, it was being summoned. Laron let out a soft murmur, stirring under his blanket. Darren reached down and rocked the stroller slightly, letting his fingertips feel the wheels, the grips, the base frame. His mind replayed the odd glances, the tailing behavior, the tone of voice. And now, the trigger phrase. Something was off. Very off. The next moment arrived without warning. As a wave of passengers surged toward Gate 72 for early boarding announcements, space tightened around the seating area. A man with a duffel bag passed too closely. The stroller's front wheel rolled gently, accidentally, into Rhett's suitcase. It barely grazed it, but Rhett stood up like he'd been struck. "Watch it," he snapped, stepping aggressively toward Darren. His tone was exaggerated, performative, as if waiting for a script cue. "Are you serious right now?" Darren straightened slowly. Not defensive, not aggressive, just upright. "I didn't touch you," he said, keeping his voice controlled, his eyes steady. "Oh, no?" Rhett leaned forward close enough that Darren could smell the bitterness on his breath. "You think you're special? Pushing your junk everywhere, thinking you're above everyone else?" Other passengers began to pause mid-step. Conversations quieted. A low current of unease slipped through the crowd. Marin Solvak reappeared from behind the gate counter, eyes wide, uncertain. "I saw the stroller bump your luggage," Marin began, hesitant as if unsure who he was supporting. "It rammed it," Rhett barked, pointing with venom. "You're going to wait till someone gets hurt, or do you only care when certain people get hurt?" His words were vague enough to blur lines, specific enough to provoke. Darren said nothing. His jaw didn't clench. His hands didn't shake. But inside, everything tightened. This wasn't about luggage. It wasn't about a stroller. This was targeted. And escalating. "I suggest you calm down," Darren said finally evenly. "My child is here. That's all that matters right now." "Yeah," Rhett sneered. "And maybe some people don't want kids like that flying first class." A beat of silence cracked through the crowd. One man looked up from his tablet. A woman clutched her carry-on tighter. Marin took a step back, torn between intervening and staying out of it. Darren didn't blink, but inside, something clicked into place. This wasn't spontaneous. This was built, scripted, played like a scene rehearsed before the curtains rose. Rhett's anger wasn't reactive, it was performative, strategic. Darren stepped slightly in front of the stroller, his stance subtly shifting to block direct access from Rhett. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Rhett's gaze dropped to Darren's hand on the stroller grip, then rose slowly to meet his eyes. There was a flicker, just a flicker, of hesitation. But it passed. Rhett muttered, "You think you're untouchable." "No," Darren said quietly. "I think you're out of moves." It wasn't bravado. It was fact. Marin, voice shaking slightly, tried again. "Gentlemen, please, there's no need to make this something it isn't." Rhett waved him off without turning. And still, no one stepped in. The passengers watched. No heroes among them. Just eyes, phones, breath held. Darren made a note of every witness, every shadow, every exit. And Rhett? He made a mistake. He stepped 1 inch too close, close enough to cross a silent line. Darren's grip on the stroller tightened, not in fear, but in quiet readiness. Because now the timing was changing. The room was shifting. And this wasn't random anymore. Rhett's next move would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The kick struck without warning, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably aimed. The stroller jolted sideways, its front wheel rattling violently against the jet bridge floor. The sudden motion startled Laron awake, and a frightened cry burst from the baby's throat. Gasps erupted from nearby passengers. A woman clasped her hand to her mouth. A man instinctively stepped forward, only to hesitate as he gauged the unfolding situation. Rhett Varson recoiled half a step, raising his hands in mock innocence, his expression twisted into a theatrical mask of surprise. "Sorry," he said too quickly. "Didn't see it there." But Darren Holt wasn't watching his words. He was watching his balance, his instincts, and the tilt of Rhett's shoulders. He stepped swiftly between Rhett and the stroller, placing one firm hand on the stroller's handle while his body blocked access. His expression shifted, not into rage, but into something colder, controlled, measured, dangerous. "Watch your step," Darren said softly, voice like low thunder, calm but charged. His eyes didn't blink. Rhett leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Darren. "Should have kept that thing out of first class." The words struck harder than the kick, not because of their content. Darren had heard worse in darker places, but because of the tone, the calculated malice, the deliberate escalation. It wasn't random. It wasn't heat-of-the-moment frustration. It was a provocation. Darren said nothing. His jaw tightened, but his shoulders remained loose, neutral. He shifted slightly, his back now subtly shielding Laron while his eyes swept the corridor behind Rhett. No immediate threat. No visible weapon. But something was wrong. The rhythm of this encounter didn't match chance, it matched operation. Behind them, the gate agent Marin Solvac appeared again, his steps halting as he caught the tail end of the commotion. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice uncertain, pitched to please both parties. His hands fiddled with the device on his belt. "I tripped," Rhett said quickly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Didn't see the stroller." "He kicked it," came a voice from the line, a teenager near the window. "He kicked it on purpose." Marin blinked. "Sir?" Darren turned his head just enough to meet Marin's gaze. "We're fine," he said, steady as steel. "No harm done." Laron was still whimpering, clutching the edge of his blanket. Darren gently rocked the stroller, his other hand brushing over the concealed zipper inside his jacket. A subtle move. A deliberate signal. The fabric parted just enough to reveal the glint of dark navy. Rhett saw it. His entire face changed. What had moments before been smug superiority now cracked at the edges. His mouth faltered open. His eyes locked onto the badge with a flicker of confused recognition, then fear. It wasn't a standard ID. It was a sealed insignia. Silver lines coiled into an eagle and anchor crest, edged with deep matte blue. The badge of the Naval Special Response Division. Not a decoration. A designation. Darren zipped it half-closed again. Still, no threats, no warnings. Just a quiet storm building behind his gaze. Rhett tried to recover. "Look, there's a lot of people here. I didn't mean to." His words stumbled over themselves, lacking rhythm now. He looked around as if for support, but the crowd had shifted. A few passengers were murmuring, unsure whom to believe, but none were defending him. A brief silence descended on the jet bridge, broken only by the quiet creak of wheels as the line resumed moving forward. Marin hesitated, but took a step back, distracted by a voice in his earpiece. He nodded to Darren and returned to the gate podium. Rhett, breathing harder now, remained behind Darren as the stroller moved forward. But his confidence had been cracked. The glance at the badge had done more than startle him. It had revealed he was playing a game he did not understand. Darren's mind moved fast. The kick had been more than anger. It had been a test, a message. He scanned Rhett's posture, the slight bulge in the coat pocket, the lack of personal luggage. None of it matched a casual traveler. Either Rhett was acting alone or he was a pawn in something larger. Either way, Darren's internal alarm had shifted from yellow to orange. The mission wasn't just about making it to Elvern City anymore. The threat was now immediate, and it had touched the one thing he never allowed anyone to endanger, his son. Laren's cries had faded, replaced by soft, hiccuping breaths as he calmed again. Darren reached down, gently readjusting the blanket around him, eyes never leaving Rhett. The man stepped forward again, slower this time. "We can just move on, all right? No need to get everyone riled up over—" "You've already made enough of a scene," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Step back." Rhett hesitated. Then, against all logic, he smirked. But it wasn't confidence. It was the smirk of a cornered man trying to fake control. "Badges don't mean much in the sky," he said, echoing someone else's words. "Practiced, rehearsed." Darren didn't respond, but his silence was deafening. Passengers continued boarding ahead of them. The line crept forward. The overhead lights cast long shadows on the carpeted floor. Rhett lingered, lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced again at the jacket. The badge was no longer visible, but the memory of it had burned itself into his expression. Darren adjusted the stroller once more, smooth and slow, every move deliberate. Not reacting, responding. A discipline born of long nights on operations where overreaction meant failure and restraint meant survival. He didn't look back as he pushed forward into the mouth of the jet bridge, but every passenger who had witnessed the moment did. They followed the stroller with their eyes, some in awe, others in discomfort. And Rhett, for the first time, remained behind without words. The corridor felt colder, narrower, heavier with meaning. Darren's instincts screamed that this was only the beginning, that the kick was just the match. The fire was still waiting. Somewhere past the cabin door, something waited for him, not just another provocation, but a plan. He glanced down once more at his son, still calm now beneath the soft hum of the jet bridge, and as he stepped into the aircraft, the final thought pulsed through him like thunder. The stroller was no longer the only thing in danger. Something much bigger had just been set in motion. Rhett's open palm slammed against Darren's shoulder without warning. The force wasn't enough to knock him off balance, just enough to signal intent. Darren didn't flinch. His boots planted with precision on the carpeted jet bridge floor, absorbing the shove as smoothly as a weighted pendulum returning to rest. The motion was familiar, practiced, ingrained from years of unarmed tactical drills. He said nothing at first, only turned his head slightly, eyes locking on Rhett's with a calm intensity that revealed nothing, and everything. A sharp gasp came from a passenger behind them. The murmur of rolling luggage wheels paused. The atmosphere, already taut from the awkward boarding sequence, snapped into silence like a coiled wire ready to lash. Rhett took a small step back, his jaw tight, eyes darting toward the stroller ahead. Laron, now half asleep, cheeks damp from earlier tears. Darren reached forward instinctively, his palm smoothing the blanket across his son's chest, never breaking eye contact with the man behind him. "You all right there, sir?" A voice cut through the moment. Arlen Voss, a young flight attendant in a Navy vest, approached from the aircraft doorway with brows furrowed, eyes shifting from Darren to Rhett. "He rammed the stroller into me," Rhett blurted, his tone loud and performative. "I nearly tripped." Darren's lips pressed into a neutral line. He said nothing at first. Around them, the few passengers still on the bridge froze, half-turned, half-interested, half-afraid to become part of the scene. The jet bridge felt like a theater stage, and someone had just yanked open the curtain. Arlen hesitated, his gaze unsure. "Did that happen, sir?" he asked Darren carefully. "No," Darren replied, his voice even and low. The stroller didn't touch him. He initiated contact. His tone held no aggression, only clarity. His right hand never left the stroller handle, his posture perfectly centered. Rhett huffed in disbelief, but Darren didn't turn back to him. He slowly opened the zipper on his jacket just enough for the edge of a dark navy badge to show beneath. The polished silver glint of the insignia caught the light, just briefly, just for Rhett. The effect was immediate. Rhett's pupils contracted. His jaw slackened for the faintest second, barely perceptible to anyone else, but Darren saw it. The recognition, the discomfort, the sudden shift from predator to uncertain operative. Yet Rhett recovered quickly, too quickly. "Badges don't matter here," he muttered under his breath, words chosen with eerie precision. Not whispered out of cowardice, but rehearsed, as if he had been told exactly what to say. The phrase struck Darren harder than the shove. That wording wasn't born from impulse, it was planted. His mind, already sharp, narrowed focus like a lens tightening. The incident wasn't just random aggression anymore, it was staged, measured, and it had a script. Somewhere behind the layers of performance, someone had written this moment. Darren looked past Arlen and toward the aircraft interior. "I'd like to board now," he said. Arlen gave a half nod, stepping aside. But as Darren pushed the stroller forward, he noticed Rhett's eyes shift, not at him, but toward Arlen. A flicker, a brief glance, a non-verbal exchange. Darren registered it instantly. Rhett's hostility wasn't solo. It was coordinated. And the flight attendant, whether knowingly or not, was caught in the middle, or worse, aligned. He continued rolling forward, Laron softly cooing beneath the blanket, his tiny fist curled under his chin. Darren's face remained composed, but inside, wheels turned fast. Training kicked in, not the aggressive kind, but the silent, watchful kind. Observation mode. A misread altercation in a jet bridge could have 100 outcomes, and every one of them could be used against him, especially if someone wanted to fracture his focus before a critical delivery. He tightened his hand on the stroller handle, eyes flicking subtly to the cameras mounted at intervals along the bridge. At least 3. All should be active. That was a detail he would verify later. Arlen stepped back toward the threshold of the plane but gave one last look over his shoulder at Darren, another subtle gesture that didn't match procedure. Flight attendants usually focused on passenger flow, not lingering glances. Darren now knew the next few minutes inside the aircraft would demand everything: his restraint, his clarity, and his awareness. And not just for his safety or his son's. His prototype module, secured and encrypted in his carry-on, wasn't just tech. It was leverage. And someone, somewhere, wanted to shake him hard enough to forget that. He whispered softly, more to himself than to Rhett. "Keep pressing me, and you'll see where badges do matter." Rhett didn't hear him. The stroller glided over the metal threshold into the cabin. The flight hadn't even begun, and already the mission had changed. The cabin door of Oranair Flight 623 slid open with a gentle hydraulic hiss, revealing the sleek, polished interior beyond. Darren Holt stepped inside with steady purpose, guiding the navy blue stroller along the carpeted aisle. Warm, amber lighting traced the overhead panels, giving the cabin a falsely serene glow. He moved forward toward his designated seat in first class, row 2A, and gently positioned the stroller beside his seat, ensuring it was secure before unfastening a small strap and adjusting the blanket over Laron, who stirred lightly but did not cry. Behind him, footsteps followed too closely. Darren's senses caught the rhythm before he even turned to look. He already knew who it was. "I guess I'm right behind you," came the voice, Rhett Varson. Smug, almost amused. The kind of coincidence that didn't happen by accident. Darren's shoulders remained square. He didn't turn. He simply reached for his seatbelt and fastened it slowly, deliberately. His eyes scanned the area, 2 rows forward, 3 behind. A quick assessment. 8 passengers in first class, all male. Most appeared disinterested, heads bowed toward phones or reclined with headphones already on. But from the corner of his eye, Darren saw another familiar face from the gate, Arlen Voss, the same flight attendant who had watched him suspiciously at the jet bridge. Arlen now stood near the galley, arms crossed, his eyes flicking between Darren and Rhett. Not once did they linger with concern for the baby. Instead, they narrowed with suspicion. Dramatic irony thickened the air. The wrong man was being watched. Darren leaned slightly to his left, adjusting the strap of the prototype case at his feet. The cool click of its biometric lock reassured him, but not entirely. He noticed something else. A glance. Arlen flicked his gaze toward Rhett, and Rhett responded with the slightest nod. It wasn't overt. It was the kind of exchange trained eyes might miss. But Darren's weren't just trained. They were forged through years of operational vigilance. He had seen this coordination before, in darker places, under harder skies. A signal. Darren's expression didn't change, but attention gathered behind his stillness. His internal posture shifted from civilian to tactical. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was staging. And then it happened. Clang. Rhett's metal water bottle slipped, or so it seemed, from his hand and rolled loudly across the aisle. It struck the base of the stroller with a sharp tap. Laron jerked under the blanket and let out a startled cry. Darren stood. No words, no dramatics, just presence. He stepped between the stroller and Rhett with controlled precision, his frame relaxed but solid. His eyes locked on Rhett's. No aggression, just a quiet readiness that said everything without saying anything. Rhett smirked and leaned slightly forward. "Nervous traveler?" he muttered, his tone playful but laced with something meaner. "Things tend to shake loose when people bring too much with them." Darren didn't blink. He bent slightly to retrieve the bottle, his jacket shifting just enough for the badge inside the zipped pocket to glint. A flash of dark navy and silver, brief but deliberate. He didn't close it. From the side, Arlen Voss's gaze caught the badge, and something shifted in his expression. But not fear, not respect, annoyance, as if the badge had made things complicated. Darren registered the micro-expression instantly. Arlen's jaw tightened. His brows drew together, not in concern but calculation. And that was all Darren needed to know. More than one person on this aircraft was part of something coordinated. He wasn't just being watched. He was being boxed in, prodded, pushed toward an outcome. He recalled the words from training. If it feels staged, assume it is. His right hand rested gently on the stroller's handle. Laron had settled, sensing his father's stillness. Darren's breathing slowed, heart rate controlled. His mind sharpened like a knife being pulled across whetstone. He scanned the seats again. Row 3B, row 1D. A man with mirrored glasses was pretending to nap, but the angle of his head was slightly too stiff. Another, further back, held a book upside down. Not passengers, watchers. And yet, Darren remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask questions. He didn't accuse, because that's what they wanted. A scene, a confrontation, a reaction. Instead, he sat back down. The badge remained visible in the fold of his jacket. He didn't hide it, but he didn't flaunt it either. The message was clear. I see you. I'm not playing your game. A few minutes passed. Boarding continued. Cabin noise swelled and ebbed with each new passenger. But between row 2 and row 3, the silence was electric. Then came the whisper. Rhett leaned forward just enough, voice low, almost conversational. "You won't make it to Elvrin City." The words were soft but unmistakable. Darren didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He simply looked forward, his eyes fixed ahead like a man who had already mapped out every possible outcome. When he finally turned his head just slightly, his gaze met Rhett's, not with rage or fear, but with something colder, something deeper, a calm carved from places Rhett had never walked. And Rhett's smirk wavered. The coil of tension drew tighter. The aisle lights dimmed slightly as the plane prepared for pushback, but it wasn't the cabin lighting that made everything feel darker. It was the growing realization that something was being set into motion, something far more dangerous than a kicked stroller or a metal bottle, and Darren was already preparing for it. And with that whisper, Darren knew the real danger had only just revealed itself. The cabin lights flickered once, just a blink, and Darren Holt's eyes opened wider. He didn't startle, didn't gasp, didn't even blink in return. Instead, he slowly slid his laptop closer on the tray table, the gentle click of its hinge folding back beneath his fingertips as he typed in a silent command. From the outside, It looked like any other father reviewing notes during a flight, but the truth behind the screen was far more urgent. A secure file opened titled simply, Cascade 9 Irregularities. Each entry detailed communications disruptions, intercepted signals, unauthorized proximity scans. The encrypted log was part of the classified prototype in his possession. And this wasn't just a file anymore, it was a target. Across the aisle, Arlen Voss strolled past row 2 with forced cheer in his step, the kind of artificial enthusiasm that flight attendants wore like armor. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked back toward Darren in subtle pulses, measuring his reactions like a scientist monitoring a test subject. Darren noticed. Of course he did. He didn't look up. Instead, he tapped a diagnostic scan into the corner of the screen. Signal integrity check. Pass. External scan. Interference detected. His fingers paused. Then the cockpit announcement followed, thin and tinny through the overhead speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just experienced a minor power reroute due to standard balancing procedures. Please remain seated with your belts fastened as we adjust for a brief channel drift. Darren's heart didn't race, but his breath deepened slightly. Channel drift. That phrase wasn't part of public airline terminology. It belonged to a specific lexicon used by tactical intercept specialists. A term used when intentional electromagnetic masking was applied to scan or disorient encrypted devices. His prototype, stored beneath his seat in a reinforced case tethered to the cabin floor, had just been brushed by something unfriendly. Across the aisle, Rhett Varson sat with his phone angled lazily in one hand, the other resting too casually on his thigh. His posture didn't scream predator, but his eyes, those were hunting. They didn't move over the screen. They moved over Darren, always watching, waiting. Darren leaned forward slightly, bent as if checking the seatbelt beneath his child's stroller. His hand passed beneath the front panel, fingers brushing over the secure strap holding the biometric case. Still intact. Still locked. But something didn't feel right. He straightened and lifted the baby monitor screen embedded in the stroller's side bar. Laron's soft breathing came through, peaceful, but the screen flickered. Once. Then again. Darren's spine tightened. His eyes shifted from the monitor to Rhett without turning his head. The angle of his gaze remained forward, but his voice slipped out in a murmur, flat and razor-edged. You placed it too close to the coil. You'll short it before you track it. Rhett froze, just for a second. His thumb hovered over the phone screen, no longer scrolling. That brief stillness was confirmation enough. Darren had struck the truth like a hammer to glass. The response came not from Rhett, but from Arlen, who now passed again, this time faster, more purposeful. His hand grazed his collar where a small, barely noticeable intercom pin blinked once. Red light. Active signal. He was reporting something. Darren's breath steadied. He didn't react. He didn't even blink. But his mind raced in 3 dimensions, mapping the plane, calculating distance to cockpit, noting passenger positions. This wasn't harassment. It wasn't coincidence. The stroller kick, the seat assignment, the flicker, the announcement, all of it aligned like a silent checklist. They're not just watching me, he thought. They're managing me, and they think I'm unaware. He glanced toward the rear lavatories, then to the reflective dome above row 3, standard cabin surveillance. He'd need to use it. Every movement from now on had to be recorded, archived, and duplicated through his device. He reached subtly into the side panel of the laptop, finger pressing a recessed button. A green light blinked once in response, invisible to all but those who knew where to look. Recording started. In the row behind him, Rhett shifted again. He leaned forward slightly as if stretching his back, but his posture suggested anticipation. His phone wasn't recording Darren. It was scanning him. Darren ran a hand across the top of Laron's stroller, checking the buckles, then brushed his knuckles along the side rail where the monitor cable ran. He felt it, barely perceptible heat where none should be. A foreign sensor, likely passive, maybe live. Installed while his attention had been diverted. He spoke again, softly. Not for Rhett this time, but for himself. They think they're scanning a package, but I'm not the package. His words vanished beneath the hum of the aircraft. Arlen, now halfway to the cockpit, tapped once more on his pin. Darren watched the muscle twitch in his jaw as he passed. Then he realized something critical. Arlen was no longer watching LaRon. He was watching the bag. They weren't just trying to sabotage the prototype. They were trying to make Darren look like the saboteur. If anything went wrong, if signals spiked, if anything shorted, it would be Darren's name tied to the disruption. Not theirs. A perfect frame. He pulled his laptop screen down slowly. Every move was measured now. Every breath deliberate. He resecured the strap beneath his seat, tightened the magnetic lock on the case, and pressed his heel to the pressure plate hidden beneath the cabin carpet. The second layer of biometric defense activated, one he hadn't used in years. A soft click under his boot confirmed it. In front of him, LaRon stirred. The baby monitor flickered again, but stabilized. Darren smiled, gently rubbing his son's blanket with a thumb. The boy slept through the storm. Only Darren could see the clouds building. The cabin lights returned to normal brightness, but the air hadn't cleared. Not for Darren. Not for Rhett. Not for the quiet war playing out between seat rows, waged with silence, glances, and one invisible line drawn across the heart of a father's mission. And in that final moment of stillness, Darren knew exactly what this was. It wasn't surveillance of a stroller. Darren now knew the stroller wasn't the only thing under surveillance. He was the true payload. Arlen Voss crouched beside the stroller without warning, his hand drifting too slowly beneath the small blanket that covered LaRon's legs. The turbulence outside gave him cover, a subtle rattle in the fuselage, a flicker in the overhead lights. To any casual observer, it looked like a routine check on safety harnesses. But to Darren Holt, nothing about Arlen's movements was routine. "Careful with that panel," Darren said quietly, his tone calm but sharp, his eyes fixed. "It's pressurized." The words were like a tripwire. Arlen froze mid-motion. His hand jerked away from the stroller's undercarriage as if stung. He glanced up, momentarily startled, then forced a thin smile, trying to regain control of his performance. Darren said nothing more. He watched, calculated, absorbed everything. The nervous twitch in Arlen's jaw, the way his left thumb rubbed a hidden switch on his intercom pin. A silent message, perhaps. The steward wasn't working alone. Without breaking eye contact, Darren slowly unlatched his seatbelt. LaRon stirred in his sleep, but Darren's movements were practiced, precise. He lifted the infant gently against his chest with one arm while his other hand reached beneath the seat to retrieve a matte gray case. No labels, no logos. Just a biometric lock and a handle worn from years of transport. Inside was his prototype, an encrypted disaster response transmitter designed to survive signal blackouts, block interference, and deploy emergency mesh frequencies across damaged networks. Today, its very existence had triggered something dangerous. A faint chime interrupted the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice, crisp but flat. "Due to a developing weather shift in our current path, we'll be making a slight mid-course correction." Darren's eyes narrowed. The words "weather shift" were harmless to most, but to someone with tactical training, it meant something else entirely. Diversion. Cloaked coordination. Someone was buying time. Someone had tipped the flight crew, either through manipulation or money. Arlen backed away, pretending to adjust another seatbelt on the opposite aisle, but Darren had already marked him. He checked the case's lock, intact. Then, subtly, he tapped the metal rim of his watch, rotating the crown 3 notches clockwise. A silent pulse activated a recording sequence. From now on, every sound, every image, every interaction within 10 meters would be captured and uploaded in fragments to an off-grid relay server. Evidence insurance. Just then, a quiet ping echoed from the rear cabin. Soft, unnoticed by most, but Darren's ears caught it instantly, a single audio code. Not a flight tone, a signal. He turned slightly, cradling Laron closer, and scanned the aisle over his shoulder. Row 19. A bald man sat near the window, posture too upright to be casual. He wore noise-canceling headphones, but Darren could tell they weren't powered on. The man's fingers hovered near his tray, tracing patterns that mimicked relaxation but followed rhythmic patterns. 3 taps, 1 pause, repeat. Military code, low level, obsolete, but enough to spot an old operative from a different time. Second asset, confirmed. The trap wasn't just about provoking a fight, it was about containment, disruption, seizure. They needed Darren to react, to slip, to be labeled a threat. That's when they would move in. And the baby, the stroller, was the bait. Darren inhaled slowly and stood. He didn't rush. He made it look like a stretch, a simple leg-loosening walk during a stable moment of flight. Passengers barely looked up, but 3 people did. Rhett Varson, Arlen Voss, and the bald man in row 19. Each tracked his movement with the wrong kind of interest. At the rear of first class, Darren paused. He checked the stroller, secure, undisturbed for now. Then he reached into his inner jacket and pulled the badge compartment open fully. The dark navy fold revealed not just a seal, but a coded ID chip with a glint that refracted the cabin lights. Several passengers noticed. The reaction was immediate but quiet. Small gasps, exchanged glances, whispered questions. A businessman near the bulkhead blinked, then subtly nodded at Darren. Darren nodded back. One potential ally marked. Arlen moved toward the cockpit. The bald man adjusted his headphones but never blinked. Rhett sat still, but his leg bounced in controlled agitation, betraying rising stress. Darren's mind ran through contingencies. Extraction protocol was not yet activated. No formal threat had been made, but his mission had already shifted from transportation to surveillance, and if the prototype had been compromised, even slightly, he would need to neutralize the onboard threat before landing. He tightened his grip on Laron. The baby's heartbeat calmed against his chest, a rhythm that kept Darren anchored. This wasn't a battlefield, but it wasn't peace either. Just then, a soft flicker crossed the stroller's baby monitor, one that no one else could interpret. A faint glitch, a loop spike, a wire tapped. He turned toward Rhett without changing expression and said in a low voice, "You've placed it too close to the coil. You'll short it before you track it." Rhett's eyes widened, his spine stiffening like a man caught with a detonator in his lap. The whisper had hit its mark. Further up the cabin, Arlen picked up speed. Darren's gaze swept the cabin once more. Every seat, every exit, every possibility now mapped in his mind. The game had changed again. He wasn't carrying a prototype. He was carrying bait. The seatbelt sign may have been on, but Darren was already walking into war. The passenger smirked, confident his attack would go unchallenged, unaware that every second, every witness, and every movement had already been anticipated by a father trained for moments exactly like this. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable skill, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Darren didn't hesitate. He placed Laron in the arms of a sympathetic passenger, an older man seated beside the bulkhead who had witnessed the earlier stroller incident and offered a quiet nod of solidarity. "Keep him close," Darren said under his breath, his tone steady but edged with something heavier. Without waiting for a reply, he stood tall, turned toward row 3, and began walking. The cabin seemed to exhale all at once. Conversations stopped. Phone screens dimmed. Every pair of eyes nearby felt the shift in the atmosphere, like a storm had entered the plane without a single drop of rain. The temperature didn't change, but the air grew denser. Darren's footfalls were slow and deliberate, absorbing the shock of the carpeted aisle with each step. Rhett Varson, the man who once kicked a child's stroller and smirked through it, rose with theatrical ease, a lazy smirk stretching across his face like a mask made of false confidence. "You should sit down," Rhett said, his voice casual, but with an edge meant to provoke. "We're all just trying to get somewhere." Darren stopped 3 feet from him, the lights above casting a gleam along the shoulder seams of his blazer. His reply was nearly a whisper. "I am somewhere. Right now." For a moment, the smirk on Rhett's face froze, cracked. A thin fissure of unease crept in around his eyes, though he quickly tried to smother it with a slow shrug. But Darren wasn't finished. He reached inside his coat, unfolded a sleek leather ID sleeve, and pulled free a matte black clearance card. It slid out beside the Navy badge like a blade being drawn. Not loud, not flashy, but final. Rhett's eyes flicked to it, then widened. He didn't recognize the clearance level. That was the point. Arlen Voss reappeared from the galley, his face tightening the moment he saw the two men. But, unlike before, he didn't approach. He hovered instead, watching, calculating, his previous air of control replaced by the indecision of someone realizing the plan had slipped beyond his command. Darren didn't move. He lifted one hand and pointed toward the reflective dome embedded in the ceiling above. A small, barely noticeable camera lens blinked to life under its surface. "You're on camera," Darren said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Now sit." Gasps fluttered like paper across the cabin. Phones came out, passengers recording without a word. The tension expanded outward in a silent ripple. In the aisle behind them, another man stood, a figure from economy class who had earlier seemed unimportant. He wore noise-canceling headphones that were now clearly fake, his stance too square, too aware. The second operative. He stepped forward. Darren turned slightly, not breaking eye contact with Rhett. "Stop there," he said, louder this time. "Everything's being fed to a secure military server." The second man froze mid-step. He had miscalculated. The operative looked to Arlen, then back to Rhett, but neither offered direction. They were unraveling. The quiet dread in Rhett's posture finally became visible to everyone. Darren's shoulders remained level. His breathing was calm, but the temperature of his gaze dropped to Arctic. Rhett reached into his coat slowly, as if attempting to conjure a badge of his own, or maybe just bluff. But Darren had already anticipated it. In 3 swift, almost fluid movements, he stepped forward, spun Rhett's arm behind his back, extracted a phone from his inner pocket, and without so much as glancing at it, dropped the device into a half-filled glass of water on a tray table. Plunk. The sound was quiet, but final, symbolic, inevitable. Rhett gasped, his arm bent at an angle of discomfort, but he made no sound of protest. His entire body stiffened as passengers stared, some whispering, others simply watching with wide eyes and rising adrenaline. Arlen took one cautious step forward, but Darren lifted his chin ever so slightly. The message was clear. Not another inch. Leiron didn't cry. The baby sat calmly in the arms of the older man, staring across the cabin with quiet curiosity. Somehow, he understood that his father had just ended something, or maybe begun it. The silence was complete. Even the engines outside seemed distant, muted by the weight of the moment. Darren released Rhett's arm slowly, letting him settle back into his seat with shame pressing down like gravity. He didn't need to restrain him with words. The cabin had already decided whom they trusted. Darren turned, brushing the edge of his badge sleeve shut, and adjusted his blazer. "Next time," he said, his voice cool as steel, "don't touch my child's life to deliver a message." And as Rhett sat restrained by silence and shame, Darren zipped his badge shut once more, mission intact. "Mr. Holt, the captain requests your presence in the cockpit. Verification purposes," the intercom voice announced, cutting through the cabin's uneasy silence like a thin blade. Darren's eyes didn't blink. His breathing stayed level. He shifted his gaze slowly toward the front of the aircraft, where the cockpit door remained sealed. Around him, passengers whispered, their earlier fear now morphing into an anxious curiosity. Rhett remained still in his seat, wrists subtly restrained by a security band, his face downcast, not defeated, but calculating. The second operative, Colt Havers, had also returned to his seat in economy, his presence now quiet but unresolved. Darren leaned slightly to the man seated beside him, a young traveler who had earlier offered to hold Laurent's pacifier, and said in a steady tone, "Can you keep your eyes on him?" He motioned to Laurent, who lay nestled in his blanket, calm and unaware of the storm surrounding him. The man nodded solemnly, already sensing the weight of what was unfolding. With calm precision, Darren unzipped the top layer of his jacket, ensuring the deep navy badge rested in full view. The insignia caught the soft, overhead light just enough to gleam, a silent reminder of who he truly was. He stood, every motion efficient, his posture both relaxed and commanding. Several passengers lifted their phones instinctively, some filming, others just stunned. As he walked the aisle, the tension returned. Not the same as before. This was different. He was no longer being watched as a potential threat, he was being watched as something far more unsettling. A man who knew exactly what he was walking into and was doing it anyway. The cockpit door opened just as he reached it. Captain Varn Liren stood inside, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting just beside the throttle bank. His uniform was crisp, posture official, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked away quickly, avoiding Darren's direct gaze. "Captain," Darren said flatly. "Mr. Holt," Liren replied, voice clipped. "We've received an instruction to divert course for a security inspection." Darren didn't blink. "From who?" The captain hesitated. That pause said everything. "Not from you, I gather." "No," Darren replied. He stepped just slightly into the cockpit, not to intrude, but enough to make it clear he wasn't intimidated. His eyes darted to the co-pilot, stone-faced, expression unreadable. "I see," Darren said quietly. "Let's make sure everyone stays safe, especially the innocent." Captain Liren's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked once more toward the overhead console, as though seeking refuge in instrumentation. Darren didn't push further. Instead, he turned and walked back to his seat with the same slow, steady pace. Every step back to row 2 became heavier with realization. Someone had intercepted the emergency burst. The signal he had fired off moments ago from his prototype, a signal meant to alert Federal Command, had been rerouted, and now Flight 623 was being taken off its original course. Not for inspection, for isolation, for silencing. He sat down, one hand instinctively reaching to brush Laren's tiny blanket, ensuring the child was still warm, safe, undisturbed. Then, slipping his phone into his palm, Darren opened a secure app hidden behind an innocuous calendar icon. The keypad bloomed on the screen, numbers, dots, dashes. He typed a message with one thumb. Echo 4, Flight 623, emergency burst intercepted. Possible compromise at command level. Requesting pre-landing recon. Vossmere Airfield listed. Confirm. He hit send. His fingers didn't stop. Another screen opened. A contingency plan, quietly developed, never shared. Names, protocols, scripts for exactly this scenario. Hostile interception during transit. He began assembling the steps. Layered encryption would protect the message until it was received. But time was narrowing. A child, 2 rows behind, laughed suddenly, unaware of the coil of tension growing in the cabin. Darren looked at Laurent. The baby's eyes fluttered in sleep, mouth parting in a faint sigh. Peaceful. That's why he was doing this. He took a long breath and closed the secure message app. The next step wasn't technical. It was human. He surveyed the cabin again, making eye contact with a man across the aisle who had filmed earlier. The man met his eyes and gave the slightest nod. Darren returned it. Witnesses were essential. He wasn't just preparing for landing anymore. He was preparing for whatever came after. Then came the vibration. His backup device, a slim, independent encrypted module in his coat lining, pulsed once against his ribs. He retrieved it casually. A new message glowed on the screen. Extraction, standing by. Tracking, Vosmir. It was signed, Echo 4. Darren allowed himself the smallest smile. Jarrell Corrin was alive and watching. His old demolitions partner, his last fallback. That changed everything. But before he could process further, a soft tap came from the aisle. A young male flight attendant, barely older than 20, stepped close. His expression was different. Nervous, yes, but sincere. In his hand, he held a folded note. "A passenger in economy asked me to give you this," he said quietly. Darren took it without a word and unfolded it. Inside was a rough pencil sketch of a symbol he hadn't seen in over 10 years. It was drawn unevenly, like by someone trying to remember from long ago. The insignia wasn't official, but it was real. A sun rising behind a ravine, 3 stars above it. Darren stared at it. Only 6 people ever knew that symbol. It was from a field op so buried even the Navy had scrubbed it. And one of those 6 had been a medic. He looked up. In the last row of economy, a teenage boy sat, arms crossed, watching him. Their eyes met. Darren rose quietly and made his way to the back, pausing beside the boy. "Tell your dad," he said gently. "I remember the ravine." The boy's face lit up with awe and recognition. He nodded once, hard, and with that nod, something invisible shifted. Whatever trap lay ahead, Darren now had more than backup. He had allies, unexpected ones he'd earned not by rank or violence, but by mercy. As he turned back toward row 2, passengers watched him with new understanding. Phones still filmed, but what they captured now wasn't confrontation. It was control. And with every step back to row 2, Darren prepared not for landing, but for extraction. The aircraft jolted slightly as it began its descent, the cabin lights dimming to a muted amber glow. Orinair Flight 623 was no longer heading toward Elvern City. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a sterile calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to technical cooperation with authorities, we are rerouting to Vosmir Airfield for a brief inspection. We thank you for your patience." The message sounded rehearsed, too clean, too calm. Darren Holt's jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the aisle automatically, noting every twitch, every movement, every deviation from normal passenger behavior. This wasn't about cooperation, it was about containment. He glanced down at the prototype case beside the stroller, locked tight, yet humming faintly beneath the surface. The biometric seal glowed dull blue, responding only to his unique signature. Cradled against his chest, Leron stirred softly, no longer startled by the environment but lulled into sleep by the rhythmic hum of descent. Darren's arm shielded the baby instinctively. His thumb hovered over the draft screen of an encrypted message, partially typed but unsent. One line glared back at him like a trigger. "Signal Echo 4 if ground crew steps onto aircraft without uniform." His instincts hadn't failed him in the past, and they screamed now. Vosmir was not a safe diversion. It was a hand-picked location, one where help could be delayed or disabled without public scrutiny. A forgotten strip in the highlands, perfect for a quiet extraction, or a quiet disappearance. Across the aisle, Rhett Varson sat like a coiled wire, hands on his knees, shoulders tight, eyes pinned to the carpet. No longer the swaggering provocateur, no longer the smirking aggressor. He had seen the badge. He had witnessed restraint weaponized. Now he stared downward, lips tight, mind racing. Darren didn't trust the silence. Silence hid desperation. and desperate men always moved before they thought. A sharp vibration in Darren's inner jacket caught his attention. He pulled out his encrypted backup device, screened the notification under his palm, and read it in a flash. Extraction, standing by. Tracking, Vossmere. The signature was unmistakable. Echo 4. Jarrell Corrin was in motion. A flicker of relief crossed Darren's features, subtle and fleeting, like the sun between clouds. He slid the device back into its sheath. One ally was already out there. But then, something shifted in the rhythm of the cabin. A teenage boy, maybe 16, slipped from his economy seat and shuffled forward, quiet and focused. He brushed past other passengers, folded something into his palm, and approached a male flight attendant standing mid-aisle. The attendant hesitated, then crossed to Darren and leaned down. "The kid says you saved his father once," he whispered. "He said to show you this." Darren reached out and unfolded the small paper. At first glance, it was a child's drawing, a crude sketch of a ridge and a figure pulling another from a cliffside. But in the center, hidden in the folds of pencil and shade, was an emblem. 3 parallel lines intersecting a broken circle. A symbol only 6 men alive would remember. His fingers stopped mid-fold. He looked back at the boy. The teen stood watching him silently, eyes wide with something between awe and fear. Darren stepped forward, careful not to disturb Laron, and crossed to him. He knelt to eye level, steady and composed. "Tell your dad," he said softly. "I remember the ravine." The boy nodded quickly, emotion flitting across his face, relief, maybe gratitude. Darren knew the message had been sent. What he didn't know was how many more allies might be silently watching, waiting, hidden in plain sight. What he had once given without reward, saving a medic in a mission so dark it was wiped from record, had now circled back, the way only fate or war ever did. He returned to his seat, hands steady, mind calculating. With one message to Echo 4 and another carried in the heart of a boy, the pieces were aligning. Something was building. Not just tension, momentum. Outside, landing gears deployed with a metallic clunk. The cabin tilted slightly, descent beginning in earnest. Through the oval windows, nothing but darkness and sparse mountain silhouettes greeted the eyes. No terminal lights, no bustling runway, no welcome signs. Vossmere wasn't expecting tourists. Darren checked the stroller's wheels, locked them into place, and ran one last diagnostic from the tactile switch under the case's hinge. The biometric readout responded instantly. No interference. No tampering. Not yet. His finger paused near the second layer, a safety override embedded into the alloy. If someone tried to force it open, the data wouldn't just erase, it would transmit. A few rows behind, Rhett finally lifted his eyes, locking with Darren's. But the spark was gone. He wasn't challenging anymore. He was wondering if whatever plan he'd been part of had now spiraled out of his control. Darren didn't blink. He held the stare for 2 seconds, then looked down at his son. Laron's chest rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, unaware of the storm forming beneath his father's calm exterior. The captain made another announcement, vague and clinical. "We are now beginning final approach. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." Darren's fingertips brushed over the case once more. He had always believed that chaos reveals who is real. This landing wouldn't be a conclusion. It would be a reveal. And when the wheels touched down at Vossmere, Darren knew he was no longer outnumbered, just out in the open. The aircraft door hissed open with a mechanical groan, revealing the sharp, pale floodlights of Vossmere Airfield and the silhouettes of waiting ground agents. They stood in rigid formation, at least at first glance. But Darren Holt's eyes, trained over years of covert deployments, caught the telltale signs in less than a second. One insignia was inverted, another patch was stitched in an outdated pattern, and one agent's stance was military, yet wrong, like a theater performance without rehearsal. Something was off. Not one of them had a name badge. Not one made eye contact. Without hesitation, Darren scooped his son Leron from the stroller and placed him into the arms of a trusted passenger, an older man who had seen everything since Gate 72. Darren gave him a single nod, a quiet contract of trust. Then he turned, stepped forward, and raised his voice, calm but commanding. "This is an unauthorized inspection," he said, projecting authority through stillness. "Step back, or you will be recorded violating international air transit laws." Murmurs stirred behind him. Passengers began raising their phones instinctively, eyes darting from the looming figures at the door to the badge now fully visible on Darren's chest, navy and silver, unmistakable. The lead imposter hesitated, jaw twitching, caught between command and fear. Then came a barked voice from the rear of the group, harsh and impatient. "Take him now!" The moment cracked like a lightning bolt. Several agents began to step forward, hands reaching toward their belts, but then a sound split the night. A sharp, two-note whistle from beyond the tarmac. Heads turned. A man emerged from behind a parked fuel truck, long coat whipping in the wind, beard grizzled with age, and a limp that made every step look like a battle scar dragging behind him. His presence was heavy, not from size, but from history. His name was Jarrell Corin, Echo 4. And the moment Darren saw him, he knew the trap had misfired. Before the imposters could react, two metallic clicks rang out from beneath the aircraft. From the luggage hold, twin black drones rose silently, mechanical wings unfolding with precision. Their circular optics glowed faint blue, each locking onto targets in perfect synchronization. Audible gasps followed. The drones hovered just inches from the heads of the nearest imposters, targeting systems tracking every breath. The agents froze. Darren didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke clearly into the tension-filled air. "You tried to use my child to smuggle fear, but I smuggled truth." Behind him, Rhett Varson, a man once so confident in his plan, began to hyperventilate in his seat. His shoulders shook, not from cold, but from the collapse of whatever illusion of control he thought he had. Jarrell stepped up the boarding stairs with deliberate pace, eyes scanning the imposters with disdain. "Told you I still owed you one," he said, stopping beside Darren. His voice was gravel, his salute 2 fingers raised just enough to honor and warn. Darren's reply was simple. Just needed a ride home. Passengers began to cheer. It was not raucous, but something deeper, relief wrapped in justice. The real federal convoy, alerted by Jarrell's encrypted field ping, arrived seconds later from the southern hangar. Their flashing lights revealed the lie in full, forcing the imposters to drop their stolen postures and surrender, one by one. Inside the aircraft, flight staff stood stunned. Arlen Voss, the attendant who had once doubted Darren, backed into the galley in silence. No apology would be enough. The prototype case remained secure at Darren's side, its biometric lock pulsing faintly in sync with his heartbeat. But the mission was no longer just about the device. It was about the quiet line he had drawn between harm and protection, between intimidation and fatherhood. Leron slept through it all, unaware, unharmed, unshaken, and as the imposters were handcuffed on the tarmac and escorted into real custody, the glow from the landing lights bathed the aircraft in a surreal calm. Darren zipped the badge shut once more, sealing the night with silence. And in the glow of the landing lights, the badge zipped away, the mission sealed, and a father's silence roared louder than war. 3 days after the incident aboard Oranair Flight 623, Darren Holt sat beneath the dimmed lights of Veltran Hall, his shoulders square, his badge resting silently on the polished oak table before him. The chamber was silent, soundproofed from the outside world, yet charged with the weight of unseen eyes. A Senate Oversight Committee convened under emergency classification had summoned him, not as an accused nor as a celebrated guest, but as the reluctant center of a national question. Across the horseshoe-shaped dais sat 6 committee members, all male, their expressions shifting between guarded neutrality and barely masked urgency. At the head of the panel sat Chairman Baron Thal, a man whose age had carved lines into his face that even politics couldn't soften. Thal's gaze was not hostile, but heavy. He tapped a single finger once on the nameplate before him, a subtle signal for the hearing to begin. "Mr. Holt," he said, voice calm, "this hearing is classified. Your testimony will not be made public, and you are under no obligation to answer anything beyond your comfort. Do you understand?" Darren nodded once. Understood. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. When Thal motioned for him to proceed, Darren leaned forward, resting his forearms gently on the table's edge. His voice was firm, but not cold. 3 days ago, I boarded Flight 623 with my 6-month-old son. Our destination was Elvrin City. The original goal was to present a prototype I've been developing, an encrypted field-grade communications relay for emergency response networks. He paused, letting the words settle. I did not anticipate that the relay would be targeted mid-air, nor that my son would be used as leverage. The room stayed utterly still. I became aware of the threat gradually. A man named Rhett Varson, posing as a passenger, initiated contact through minor provocations, escalating to physical interference with my child's stroller. A second operative was later identified, Colt Havers, formerly of an internal tech division, dishonorably discharged for unauthorized access attempts into federal relay systems. A flight attendant, Arlen Voss, was also involved. His role was less direct, but his movements and coded announcements confirmed complicity. A senator leaned forward but said nothing. Darren continued. The threats escalated when I realized the stroller's electronics were compromised, likely to trace or disrupt the prototype's signal. I activated countermeasures discreetly. I contacted a private contingency, Jarrell Corin, designated Echo 4. He extracted us safely after the aircraft was diverted under false pretenses to Vossmere Airfield. He paused again, but no one interrupted. The badge on the table glinted faintly beneath the light, the silver insignia unmistakable to anyone in defense. Chairman Thal finally broke the silence. Mr. Holt, were you operating in any official capacity during this flight? Darren shook his head. No, sir. I was traveling as a civilian. I disclosed no credentials until the threat to my child escalated. Thal looked down at the folder before him, then back up. And yet, you neutralized 2 coordinated operatives, disrupted an in-flight sabotage attempt, identified a federal breach in badge decryption, and prevented a rogue landing from turning into an extraction. Darren's response was quiet. I acted to protect my son. A long silence stretched. Papers shuffled faintly. One committee member cleared his throat but deferred to the chairman. Thal's tone shifted, softened just enough to be human. You stopped a breach using your instincts, not just your badge. Darren met his eyes unflinching. Instincts didn't save us. Preparation did. It was not said with pride, but with weight, the kind that came from knowing what it cost. A beat passed. Thal nodded slowly, as if absorbing something larger than the words alone. He turned to the other committee members and spoke without raising his voice. Let the record reflect. This committee finds no fault in Mr. Holt's actions and recognizes the urgency of immediate reforms. We are proposing legislation to strengthen private contractor screening protocols, revise airfield access tiers, and initiate a full audit of federal badge decryption processes. All in favor? Each member raised a hand. Unanimous. Thal turned back to Darren. You may be excused. Thank you for your service, Mr. Holt. Darren stood, slid the badge back into his jacket with practiced precision, and left the chamber without another word. As the door closed behind him, The voices inside faded into secure silence. Outside, a swarm of reporters waited like a tide trying to crash against a wall. Their shouts were muffled, their cameras ready. But Darren didn't pause. He moved with the same quiet resolve that had guided him through the sky. A black transport car waited at the curb, but he waved it off. Instead, he walked. Blocks later, in a quiet district shaded by winter-bare trees, Darren climbed the steps to a modest third-floor apartment. The hallway light flickered once as he approached. The door opened before he knocked. Rollick Holt stood there, wearing a faded university sweatshirt and the calm expression of a man who'd always believed his brother's silence held oceans. Inside, baby Laron cooed in his arms. "He's been good," Rollick said, stepping back to let him in. "Didn't cry once." Darren smiled faintly, reaching out to take his son. Laron nestled into his chest without protest. Rollick turned on the television. A muted news ticker scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Sources confirm. Flight 623 incident triggered security review. No public statement from passenger involved. "You always said your service ended when you became a father," Rollick said, watching the screen. Darren adjusted Laron's blanket and whispered, more to himself than to his brother, "I was wrong. It just changed uniforms." And in that moment, fatherhood and service finally stood on the same ground. "Tell your dad I remember the ravine," Darren said softly, his voice steady but his eyes distant, staring beyond the present moment as if tracing back through a fog of memory. The teenager nodded with reverent silence, his hand still lightly gripping the folded drawing he'd passed to Darren moments earlier. In the illustration, a rough sketch of the aircraft filled the page, and across one wing were scrawled 7 quiet words. "You stopped them without yelling once." Darren didn't smile immediately. He simply looked at the boy, then at the crowd dispersing from the security seminar. No one knew how much had been held back in his restraint, how close everything had come to breaking. Outside the small, windowless auditorium inside the Veltron Federal Engineering Hall, sunlight filtered through tall glass panels, catching dust in long, quiet beams. Inside, the room had just emptied after Darren's speech, his first and only public appearance since the Oranair Flight 623 incident. Unlike the chaotic expo he had originally planned to attend in Elvrin, this seminar was quiet, grounded, filled with men who understood systems, not headlines, engineers, federal liaisons, risk assessors, men who wanted answers, not applause. The lecture had started with no introduction. Darren stood alone at the front of the room, a compact case of disassembled prototype parts beside him, his son, Laron, seated calmly in the front row on the lap of Rollick Holt, Darren's younger brother. Laron held a small toy badge, something Darren had fashioned out of scrap alloy in the days after the debrief, not for symbolism, but for comfort. A child's grip on meaning. "I'm not here to talk about war," Darren had begun, scanning the rows of faces that watched him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "I'm here to talk about what happens when someone brings a child into a tactical situation, and how you respond without becoming a threat yourself." The room had gone silent then, and remained so for the next 40 minutes. Darren detailed the moment-to-moment choices he made on the plane, how he weighed perception, strategy, witness positioning, and psychological profiles, all while holding his infant son in one hand and a suppressed conflict in the other. He never named Rhett, never pointed fingers. He told the story like a debrief with no enemy, just pressure, decisions, and outcomes. "What I carried on that flight wasn't just a prototype," Darren said. "It was the responsibility to ensure no one got hurt, even the people trying to provoke me. My job wasn't to punish them. It was to stop them from escalating." One official, seated in the back row, tapped notes rapidly into a tablet. Another leaned forward, arms crossed, visibly shaken. A third, an airline safety director, whispered to the man beside him, "This is the kind of man we should have had designing protocols from the start." But Darren wasn't there to become the next consultant or symbol. He wasn't interested in being turned into policy, at least not publicly. When the applause came at the end, it was respectful but brief. Darren nodded once, stepped away from the podium and headed straight for Laurent, lifting him gently from Rollick's arms. "You did good," Rollick said in a low voice. "Didn't sound like a soldier, sounded like someone who's been thinking a long time." Darren didn't answer right away. He watched Laurent play with the toy badge, then glanced over at the teenager making his way forward through the clearing aisle. It was the same boy from Flight 623, the same young man who had passed the drawing through a folded napkin when no one else dared speak. This time, he approached on his own, a little taller than Darren remembered, but with the same clarity in his gaze. "You don't remember me," the boy said awkwardly, holding the drawing tighter. "I remember your father," Darren replied. "That's enough." The boy hesitated. "He still talks about what you did in that ravine, how they thought the whole team was gone." "I wasn't the only one," Darren said quietly. "I just got loud when it mattered." The boy gave a small smile, then extended the drawing. Darren took it, looked at it fully for the first time, and knelt down so they were eye to eye. "You carry this memory with pride," Darren said, reaching into his coat pocket. He removed a small cloth pouch, opened it, and revealed a weathered dark patch, his real one. Decommissioned, but still stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Naval Special Response Division. "This isn't for display. It's for when you need to remember what silence, when used right, can protect." The boy accepted it with both hands, nodding in a way that spoke of more than understanding. It spoke of future resolve. In the weeks that followed, the story of the badge, the stroller, and the silent restraint began circulating in federal security briefings, not as scandal, not as heroism, but as protocol. Officials began quietly referring to it as the Holt Protocol. No cameras, no press releases, just a shift, a change in how personnel were trained to de-escalate mid-air conflicts, how restraint was taught not as weakness but as tactical strength, how the presence of a child wasn't an obstacle, but a reason to be better. The Holt Protocol wasn't about war. It wasn't about enemies. It was about what to do when you are both protector and target, when escalation tempts you and silence tests you. No medals were given, no fame earned, but engineers rewrote manuals, agencies adjusted algorithms, and somewhere above the clouds, in every flight where a conflict brewed unseen, a lesson flew quietly on every route. And while the badge was zipped away for good this time, its lesson would fly in every sky thereafter. In moments, the father revealed his SEAL badge, froze the attacker, and secured the stroller while the crew watched in stunned silence. The passenger's arrogance evaporated instantly as accountability took hold. If you believe real authority acts with precision, discipline, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the power of preparation and courage in protecting loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.